Here is a man who had everything. He commanded an empire stretching from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Germania, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the edge of Mesopotamia. He had absolute power over tens of millions of lives. He had armies, wealth, palaces, and the devoted loyalty of the Roman Senate. If he wanted something done, it was done. If he wanted someone killed, they were killed. No appeal, no override, no check on his authority whatsoever. And at night, alone, this man wrote private notes to himself about how to be patient with rude people, how to get out of bed when he didn't want to, how not to let flattery corrupt him, how to accept that he was going to die. That is one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in the entire history of human civilization. The most powerful man on earth, sitting alone with a notebook, writing reminders to himself about how to be decent. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was born on April 26, 121 CE in Rome. He ruled the Roman Empire for nearly 2 decades, from 161 CE until his death in 180 CE. And the private notebooks he left behind, which he almost certainly never intended for anyone else to read, are now considered one of the greatest philosophical documents ever produced by a human being. We call them the Meditations. He called them, if he called them anything at all, taes heoton, things to himself. I want you to sit with that for a second. These were not written for you. They were not written for posterity. They were not written to impress philosophers or senators or future generations of readers who would study them in universities. They were written by a man trying to hold himself accountable, in private, with no audience. And that is precisely what makes them extraordinary. The historian Anthony Burleigh, who wrote one of the definitive biographies of Marcus, describes him as a man of genuine philosophical commitment, not a ruler who dabbled in philosophy as a hobby, but someone who took it with complete seriousness as the organizing principle of his entire life. That distinction matters, because Rome had plenty of emperors who could quote philosophers at dinner parties. Marcus was not doing that. He was using philosophy the way a serious athlete uses training, as a daily discipline, as a method for building something in himself that he feared he would otherwise lose. And what he feared losing was his character, his ability to see clearly, his ability to act justly, his ability to remain a decent human being while holding more power than any person alive. He wrote to himself, "Take care that you are not made into a Caesar, that you are not dyed with this dye, for such things happen. Keep yourself, therefore, simple, good, pure, serious, unpretentious, a friend of justice, God-fearing, gracious, affectionate, strong for your proper work." Think about that. The man already was Caesar. He had been Caesar for years when he wrote those words, and he was warning himself, actively, urgently, against becoming the thing he already was, against letting the role hollow out the person, against the corruption that power performs on character so gradually that the victim never notices until it's too late. He had watched it happen to other men. He knew exactly how the process worked. First, the flattery starts to feel normal. Then the comfort starts to feel deserved. Then the difficult truths stop reaching you, because everyone around you has learned that difficult truths make you uncomfortable. And then one day, you are a tyrant who started out as a philosopher, and you have no idea when the transformation happened. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign fighting that transformation in himself, every single day. The philosopher Pierre Hadot, who wrote one of the deepest scholarly analyses of the Meditations, makes the point that these notebooks are not a philosophical treatise. Marcus was not building a system. He was not trying to contribute to the literature of Stoicism. He already knew the philosophy. He had studied it for decades. What he was doing, Hadot argues, was practicing it, performing what the ancient Stoics called ascesis, spiritual exercise, daily training of the soul. He already knew what a good person should do. The problem was doing it. Under pressure, in a failing body, surrounded by war and plague and betrayal and the grinding weight of governing millions of people who mostly couldn't agree on anything. That gap between knowing what is right and actually doing it every day, when everything is pulling you in the other direction, that is the gap the Meditations live in. And the reason Marcus Aurelius matters to us right now is not because he was an emperor. It is because he was a human being who understood that gap and refused to stop trying to close it. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. He wrote that to himself, not to you, not to Rome, to himself. And somehow it lands harder because of that. This is what we are going to spend the rest of this video on. The Stoic mindset of Marcus Aurelius. Not as an abstraction, as a living practice, forged under conditions most of us will never face, by a man who had every reason in the world to stop trying, and didn't. So how does a man like this get made? Because Marcus Aurelius did not arrive at that kind of self-awareness by accident. The Stoic discipline, the precision of thought, the ability to sit with power and not be destroyed by it, that was built, slowly, by specific people, specific books, specific encounters that redirected the entire trajectory of his life. And this is the part that most people skip over. They go straight to the philosophy. But if you want to understand why the philosophy took root in him the way it did, you have to start at the beginning. He was born on April 26th, 121 CE. His father died when he was very young. That detail matters. He was raised primarily by his paternal grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, a man of serious character and social standing, whom Marcus would later credit in the opening pages of the Meditations with teaching him to be gentle and meek, not forceful, not commanding, gentle. That is a striking thing for a Roman emperor to say about the person who shaped him most. And then, something unusual happened. The Emperor Hadrian noticed the boy. Ancient sources tell us Hadrian was struck by the child's unusual seriousness and honesty, and he gave him a nickname, Verissimus, most true, most genuine. The Emperor of Rome looked at this 7-year-old and essentially said, "This kid doesn't pretend." I find that remarkable, because that quality, the refusal to perform, the insistence on being real, never left him. You can trace it in a straight line from that childhood nickname all the way to the private notebooks he wrote 50 years later that nobody was ever supposed to read. He began formal study young. Rhetoric, philosophy, the full curriculum of a Roman aristocrat being prepared for public life. His teacher in rhetoric was Fronto, one of the most celebrated Latin rhetoricians of the age. Fronto adored him. Their letters survive. And Fronto genuinely tried, to pull Marcus toward the literary culture of the era, the elegance, the performance, the craft of polished argument. And Marcus resisted, not with hostility, but with a kind of quiet, determined disinterest in ornament for its own sake. Later, in the Meditations, he specifically thanks the gods that he did not make further progress in rhetoric, poetry, and the other studies. He understood, even looking back, that Fronto's world would have seduced him into mistaking cleverness for wisdom. He was grateful to have escaped it. But the real turning point, the encounter that changed everything, came through a man named Quintus Junius Rusticus. Rusticus was a Stoic philosopher, a serious one. Not a lecturer, not a performer, a practitioner. And Rusticus did something that altered the course of Marcus's life. He lent him a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus. Think about that collision for a moment. Marcus Aurelius, heir to the Roman Empire, surrounded by wealth and flattery and marble and every conceivable form of external power, reads the words of a man who had been a slave, who owned nothing, who was, by every conventional Roman measure, the least powerful person imaginable. And what Epictetus taught was this: you control your judgments and your will. Everything else, health, reputation, wealth, what other people do, is outside you. Marcus later wrote that Rusticus showed him that his character required improvement and discipline. That is a devastating thing to acknowledge when you are already Caesar. He didn't write, Rusticus taught me interesting ideas. He wrote that Rusticus showed him his own character needed work. That is someone actually listening, actually changing. And so the framework clicked into place. The Stoic philosophy gave Marcus a structure his instincts had always been reaching for, but hadn't yet found. The dichotomy of control. The idea that your inner life is a sovereign territory no emperor can touch, not even the emperor inside you. For a man who was about to inherit the world, this was not an abstraction. It was the only armor that actually mattered. He then spent nearly 2 decades in apprenticeship under Antoninus Pius, the man Hadrian had arranged to adopt him. And here is where formation becomes practice. Antoninus ruled for 23 years with almost no drama, patient, deliberate, unspectacular in the best possible way. Marcus watched him closely. He later listed in the Meditations everything he had learned from Antoninus: steadiness, refusal to be hurried, indifference to flattery, willingness to hear hard truths. He was taking notes on how to be a human being before he even knew he was doing it. By the time Marcus Aurelius became emperor in 161 CE, at age 39, he had been in training for 3 decades. Under a grandfather who taught him gentleness, under a rhetorician who accidentally taught him what to resist, under a Stoic who handed him Epictetus and said, "Read this," under an emperor who modeled what patient governance looked like up close. The philosophy didn't descend on him. It was assembled, piece, by people who cared enough to actually form him. And that is what makes what comes next possible. Because what comes next is using all of that, every lesson, every discipline, every insight, against the hardest conditions imaginable. So now you have the man. You have the teachers who formed him, the philosophy that gave him his framework, the emperor he watched and learned from. Now the question is, what exactly did that philosophy say? What were the actual principles? Because this is what the whole video is about. This is the Stoic mindset, not the biography, the operating system underneath the biography. And I want to be precise here, because Stoicism gets flattened all the time into a bumper sticker about not complaining. That is not what Marcus was doing. What he was doing was far more demanding than that. It was a complete restructuring of how you relate to reality. So let's go through the actual principles one by one, the way Marcus actually practiced them. The foundation of everything is the dichotomy of control. This came directly from Epictetus. The idea is simple to state and almost impossibly hard to live. Some things are up to you, some things are not. Your judgments, your intentions, your responses, those are yours. Everything else, health, reputation, whether your campaign succeeds, whether your children live, what people think of you, that is not yours. You do not own it. Stop acting like you do. Marcus came back to this constantly. The reason he came back to it constantly is that he kept failing at it. That is the honest reading of the Meditations. He is not a man who mastered the philosophy and then wrote down his wisdom. He is a man who knew the philosophy and kept catching himself violating it. In anger, in anxiety, in the pull toward vanity, and dragging himself back. And he wrote one of the most striking morning exercises I have ever read. He starts the day by telling himself exactly who he is going to encounter. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. I love this, because there is no self-deception in it. He is not telling himself that people are secretly wonderful. He is looking at human nature clearly, without flinching. And then he finishes the thought. They are this way because they cannot tell good from evil, but I have. And that knowledge means I am not permitted to hate them. Their nature and mine are related. Both share in reason. Both share in something larger. That is the whole move. Unflinching honesty about reality, combined with a refusal to let that reality produce contempt or hatred. You can hold both of those things simultaneously. That is what he is training for. The second principle is seeing things clearly, stripping away narrative, stripping away the emotional distortion we put over everything. Marcus practiced something almost brutal in its literalness, taking the glamour off of things by describing them with absolute precision. Expensive wine is fermented grape juice. A triumph is men marching in formation. Power is a temporary arrangement of circumstances. He was not being cynical. Cynicism is its own kind of distortion. He was trying to see without the fog of desire and fear that usually sits between us and what is actually there. And then the third principle, which I think gets underappreciated. He was not just trying to manage his own inner life. He had a positive obligation. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." This is action-oriented philosophy. The point is not to achieve some perfect interior stillness while the world burns. The point is to act, for the common good, in accordance with reason, right now, with what is in front of you. The Stoics believed humans are social animals by nature. That means isolation is a violation of nature. That means your flourishing is bound up with the flourishing of others. For Marcus, ruling an empire was not separate from his philosophical practice. It was the primary arena of it. And then there is the principle that has probably traveled furthest out of his notebooks and into the modern world. He writes, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He was thinking about governance when he wrote this, practically. When something blocks what you are trying to do, you do not stop. You incorporate the obstacle. You let the resistance itself become the next action. He was living this in real time, plague, war, betrayal, and finding that the practice of the philosophy did not require good conditions. It required bad ones. The bad conditions were the material. Receive without pride, relinquish without struggle. 4 words. His entire philosophy of power and loss in one sentence. You get something, do not puff up. You lose something, do not cling. Stay the same person in both directions. This is what he was aiming at every single day as emperor, with the full weight of the world's largest empire pressing down on him. And underneath all of it, running through every page, is the practice he returned to more than any other. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. He used death not to produce despair, but urgency. The fact that it ends, that he would end, that the empire would end, that everyone who knew his name would eventually be forgotten, that fact was not something to dread. It was something to use. It clarified. It cut away everything that did not matter. And what was left, after you cut all of that away, was the present moment and the choice you make in it. That is the philosophy. Not as an abstraction, as a daily practice under real pressure with real consequences. And now the question becomes, what did that actually look like when the world handed him the worst conditions imaginable? So now we have to talk about what the philosophy actually cost him. Because it is one thing to write, receive without pride, relinquish without struggle, in a quiet room. It is another thing entirely to live that sentence when the world is on fire around you. And for the last 14 years of his life, the world was genuinely on fire. When Marcus became emperor in 161 CE, he inherited not a peaceful empire waiting to be administered. He inherited simultaneous crises arriving from every direction at once. War on the eastern frontier with Parthia. Then the troops come home from that war, and they bring with them the Antonine Plague. Historians estimate it killed 5 million people. 5 million. And then, before that has even resolved, Germanic tribes cross the Danube in numbers Rome had not seen in centuries. They push all the way into northern Italy. Marcus would spend the last 14 years of his life managing that war from the front lines. Think about what that means. He is writing his private philosophical notes, the notes we now call the Meditations, in a military camp on the Danube, in a tent, between commanding a war. He brought books to the front. He continued corresponding with philosophers. He processed legal petitions from individual citizens by hand. Surviving papyri actually confirm this. The man is running an empire with his pen while simultaneously running a war. Pierre Hadot, one of the greatest scholars of ancient philosophy, described the Meditations as spiritual exercises, not finished thoughts, but daily training. Marcus was not recording wisdom he had mastered. He was drilling himself every single day to try to become what he believed he should be. And Hadot makes the point that this discipline was inseparable from his governance. The philosophy was not something he did in addition to ruling. It was how he ruled. And he wrote himself a morning exercise to prepare for exactly what the job required. He wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are this way because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine." I love this so much. He is not naive. He is not pretending people are good when they are not. He sees them clearly, meddling, ungrateful, arrogant. He says it right out loud to himself before the day begins. And then he refuses to hate them anyway. Not because hate is impolite, because hate would be a corruption of his own judgment, and his own judgment was the only thing he actually controlled. That is the Stoic move. See clearly, respond rationally, do not let their failure become your failure. But then came the betrayal that tested all of this at its limit. In 175 CE, a general named Avidius Cassius, someone Marcus had trusted, someone he had elevated, declared himself emperor based on a false rumor that Marcus had died. The revolt collapsed within months when Cassius was killed by his own men, and Marcus reportedly expressed genuine grief, not because Cassius had failed, but because he was denied the opportunity to pardon him in person. The most powerful man in the world, betrayed by a trusted general, and his response was to grieve the loss of the chance to forgive him. That is either the most admirable thing you will ever hear about a ruler, or it is theater. And the Meditations tell you which it is. Because there is no audience for the Meditations. He wrote in them, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Nobody was going to read that. It was not a political statement. It was a man trying to talk himself into actually believing it. The physical cost is important too. Marcus was chronically ill, likely suffering from a stomach condition, possibly ulcers, for much of his life. He was dependent on theriac, a compound medicine of the era that may have contained opium, just to manage his symptoms enough to function. He pushed a failing body through decades of war and governance. He got up anyway. He actually wrote self-reminders in the Meditations to get out of bed in the morning. The Emperor of Rome, writing to himself, "Get up, do the work, stop lying there." I find that genuinely comforting. The man who commands millions of soldiers has to remind himself to get out of bed. Suffering is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. And then, the hardest part. The thing that costs him more than the plague, more than the wars, more than the betrayal. His son, Commodus. Marcus had watched Commodus. He had seen the warning signs, the vanity, the instability, the appetite for spectacle over substance. And he elevated him anyway. Commodus's reign would prove catastrophic. Vain, erratic, violent. Everything Marcus had spent his entire life trying not to become. Anthony Burleigh, in his biography of Marcus, treats this as the unresolved tragedy of the reign. The philosopher who warned himself constantly against being dyed with the Caesar dye. His own words. Take care that you are not made into a Caesar. Produced a successor who was nothing but the dye. Was it paternal blindness? Dynastic duty? A belief that Commodus might still grow into the role? We do not know. The Meditations do not address it directly. And that silence is its own kind of answer. Some things could not be resolved by philosophy. Some failures you carry without resolution. That is what living the philosophy actually looked like. Not triumphant. Not serene in the way the statues suggest. It was a man, ill, grieving, isolated by power, surrounded by people he could not fully trust, grinding against his own nature every single day, trying to hold the line. You could leave life right now, he wrote to himself. Let that determine what you do and say and think. He kept going. Not because it was easy, because he had decided it was the right thing to do, and that decision was the one thing entirely his own. What are the Meditations, really? Not a book, not a philosophy treatise, not something he wrote for us. He titled them Ta eis heuton, things to himself. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, not Roman power, alone, in a military camp on the Danube, in a body that was failing, at the edge of a war that never seemed to end. And what he wrote was not wisdom handed down from a sage. It was a man catching himself failing and trying again. That distinction matters enormously, because every other philosophical text of the ancient world was written to persuade someone, to build a reputation, to teach. The Meditations were written to do one thing: to make Marcus Aurelius behave better tomorrow than he had today. That is what makes them the most honest document of Stoic practice ever recorded. Not the most polished, the most honest. He opens Book 2 with something remarkable. Not with grand imperial proclamation, with a warning to himself about the day ahead. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He knew exactly who was waiting for him. He named them without flinching. And then, and this is the move, he refused to hate them for it. He continued, "They are this way because they cannot tell good from evil." This is not naive optimism. He is not pretending people are good. He is choosing, deliberately, as an act of will, not to be poisoned by their failures. That is the discipline. Every morning, before the petitions and the senators and the generals and the yes men, he rehearsed this. He trained his mind the way a soldier trains his body. And then there are the passages about getting out of bed. He actually had to remind himself. Do not indulge yourself by staying in bed, he wrote, paraphrasing his own instruction, pushing himself up into a cold morning, into another day of weight he had not asked for and could not put down. The most powerful man in the world, arguing with himself about whether to get up. This is what Pierre Hadot called ascesis, spiritual exercise. The meditations are not finished thoughts. They are reps. Every entry is Marcus catching a bad habit of mind, anger, vanity, self-pity, dread, and correcting it. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. He wrote that to himself. He already knew it. He needed to hear it again, because knowledge is not the same as practice, and practice is not the same as mastery. He never claimed mastery. There is one passage that stops me every time. He wrote, "Take care that you are not made into a Caesar, that you are not dyed with this dye, for such things happen." The man who was Caesar, warning himself against becoming Caesar, he understood, from watching power corrupt others, from watching himself in unguarded moments, that the role wanted to eat him, that the flattery, the deference, the absolute authority could hollow a man out from the inside and leave something imperial in shape, but rotten in substance. He refused. Every day he refused. Not effortlessly, with effort. And woven through everything is death, not as morbid obsession, as medicine. His entire philosophy of power and loss. He had buried most of his children. He had watched the plague take 5 million people. He had seen trusted men betray him. And his answer was not despair, and it was not the performance of indifference. It was this. Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight. He came back to it constantly. The Stoic practice of memento mori. Remember that you will die. Not to produce dread, but clarity. A man's life is a mere moment, his existence a flux, his perception clouded, his body's composition corruptible. What then can guide a man? Only philosophy. That is not nihilism. That is the opposite. If life is short and uncertain, then what you do with each present hour is everything. The smallness of life makes the quality of attention urgent, not irrelevant. What the meditations teach us, ultimately, is not a system. It is a posture. You will face things outside your control. War, loss, betrayal, illness, ingratitude. You cannot prevent them. What you can govern, entirely and always, is your response, your judgment, your intention. The quality of attention you bring to this moment, right now, before the next one arrives. He was not a saint. The notebooks prove it. Saints do not need to remind themselves this many times not to be angry. He was a man, chronically ill, profoundly lonely, governing an empire that was bleeding from a dozen wounds, writing to himself in the dark. Try harder. Be better. You are falling short. Try again tomorrow. And we have those notebooks, nearly 2,000 years later, written in Greek on a military campaign, never meant to survive, never meant to be read. And here they are, outlasting every army he commanded, every law he passed, every border he defended. The things he wrote to himself, alone, about how to be a decent human being, those are what remain. He spent his entire life trying to live up to it. And the trying, the daily, grinding, never finished trying, is the whole lesson. Not perfection, not arrival. The commitment to begin again, every morning, with honesty and effort, and an unbroken decision to be better than yesterday. That is the Stoic mindset of Marcus Aurelius. Not a mood, not a personality trait, a practice. One that is available to you right now, exactly where you are, with whatever empire, however small, you have been given to run. Thank you for listening to the story of Marcus Aurelius. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on who you'd like to hear about next.